Hi, this is Savannah Saunders from The Wonderful World of Dance, and today I am honoured to introduce Russell Maliphant, one of Britain's most important choreographers creating work today. Russell Maliphant has received numerous awards for his creations that he's made with the likes of world-famous ballerina Sylvie Guillaume, the UK's Ballet Boys and the Lyon Opera Ballet, plus an extensive body of work for his Russell Maliphant Dance Company. Russell's work is renowned for its unique approach to flow and energy and the exploration of the relationship between movement, light, and music. So let's learn a bit more about this incredible choreographer and his company, which is set to celebrate its 25th anniversary next year. Hi, Russell.
Hi there. Good to see
you.
So
lovely to have you.
Thank you.
So firstly, how have you been dealing with the lockdown and the whole COVID pandemic and the ever-increasing restrictions that we're facing at the moment?
Differently over the time, it's been 6-7 months, and at the beginning of lockdown, I had just finished a season at the Coronet Theatre, and that was quite intense. That was 13 performances in a row. And I was also finishing a PhD, so I kind of benefited from having some time at the beginning, and then of course sometimes it's nice to have time. It's nice to have a holiday in that from some of the things you do all of the time. But as time goes on and you don't have those things, it varies a lot. You're lost with certain elements that are a kind of necessity for your creative output, or so it got a bit dark in some of there, and it was also difficult financially. And then in August, I was supposed to have been doing the National Youth Dance Company. It was my year to direct the company, and our performances were supposed to have gone ahead in April, which of course they got cancelled. Then we were wondering, is this project going to be even possible? And together with Hannah and Joss, who run the company, we had a plan that we could make it together, not as originally imagined for 40 dancers, but we could do it for 10 dancers 4 times. And that way we managed to work with each group to get something together and to have a performance on the stage at Sadler's Wells. So we had a socially distanced process where I was directing them from the circle. They were on stage. We had one of my dancers working with each group as an assistant. And we had 3 days to work with each group on the stage. And then we could show that to friends and family who were able to stay in their bubbles. And we could get somewhere between 80 and 120 people watching the performance. So that was fantastic to be working again. And then actually that went straight into working with English National Ballet on this, on a film project, which was just for digital when we started to imagine that and discuss it. And then that has now has the potential. It's now going to perform at Sadler's Wells also, where they will have a shows in November with up to, I think it's 420 per performance. So again, it will be socially performanced. People will sit in their bubbles, socially distanced performance. People will sit in their bubbles, and we'll see how that goes.
So with those performances, some not too far away, and we are still in the midst of this pandemic, which is affecting us all. How you described sort of how you've been working with them in a socially distanced manner, and how do you think that the reduced audience may affect your feeling about your work, may be affected by this reduced socially distanced audience? Because you were talking about the Coronet Theatre, and for those who aren't in London and don't know it, it's a very intimate theatre, and this is quite the opposite. Sadler's Wells is enormous and normally holds, a couple of thousand of seated audience members. So I'm just wondering how, as the creator of this work, how that translates for you.
Well, I think generally when you're thinking about a performance at a particular venue, you're kind of thinking about the impression that it will have with the proximity to the audience. And, the proximity at somewhere like the Coronet is very different to the proximity at somewhere like Sadler's Wells or the Coliseum or the Opera House, and I don't know how it will be to have, that 400 people in there. Yeah, we'll have to wait and see. In the National Youth Dance Company performing there, when we had 60 or 80 people or 100 people in the audience, it wasn't quite like a performance as we know it. Yeah. You know what it feels like to have a packed out audience or something like this, and actually when you've got I don't know, a fraction of that, when you have 15% or 20%, or it feels different, but it's still a sharing. And actually after 6 months of not having that, to be able to share that together felt a fantastic privilege. And we were all watching it. We were all going through a journey together that's to do with movement and darkness and light and the impact of music as you sit there in the dark. And that's a wonderful journey to experience together. And you don't have it watching online. You've got something else.
And as you say, we are all going through this together, and we will experience these types of performances together. Did your dancers give you from the youth company, did they give you any feedback about how it felt for them to be on stage? As you say, not having that packed house, did they have any sort of experiences that they shared with you?
I mean, from what I heard of them, from them, they loved being on the stage. For them, it was a privilege to be on, a large stage with that big auditorium. And sometimes there's, it's often very dark and you can't really see, except for the house. You can't see people's faces, and so I think they had a very good time just being on the stage and experiencing that.
Yeah, I can imagine they must be happy to be back after such a long period away from performing live. Yes. Well, let's talk about your own career now. You're training with the Royal Ballet School, and then your journey to dancing with the Sadler's Wells Royal Ballet, which goes on to become the Birmingham Royal Ballet. Tell me about your ballet beginnings.
Well, I went along to classes with my two sisters, and I was from a one-parent family, so it was easier to have all the kids go to a class together. That gave my mum a little bit of time off, and I enjoyed dancing ballet. I enjoyed having something that you could practice and get better at and see the results of that practice. And I chose ballet as a career, and went to the Royal Ballet School. I had a very good time at the Royal Ballet School, enjoyed it immensely. But in my third year, I injured my shoulder, my arm, and I lost the use of my shoulder. So I could put one arm up and I couldn't put the other arm up at all. That lasted about 9 months, and they gave me, they allowed me to repeat my final year, and then I got into Sadler's Wells, and there was a lot about that I enjoyed. You know, they used to do a lot of new ballets and triple bills and tour everywhere. We were touring for 8 months of the year, 8 shows a week, and you know, I enjoyed much of that. Then we started to do more of the larger ballets, Swan Lake, Sleeping Beauty, and hundreds of those shows. And at that time, I was thinking, I don't enjoy doing this ballet night after night after night for months on end. And I don't know if this is for me. And I could hear myself kind of complaining about this kind of life I was living, when, you know, actually it's a great life. It's a very privileged life, and it's, you know, for many people it's a great fit. And I just felt like at that time it was no longer a great fit for me, and I didn't know quite what would be. But I knew that it was time to move on in some way. And at that time, there were several others that were kind of, there had been a shift in the company, and there was also a shift because Sadler's Wells Royal Ballet, that was based at Sadler's Wells, was negotiating a deal where they would go to Birmingham and become Birmingham Royal Ballet, which is quite close to where I grew up from. And you know, all of these things were coming together, and I thought, oh, I don't know, I want to do something else. And some of the other people at Sadler's Wells, Jennifer Jackson, Susan Crowe, Michael Batchelor, actually also Stephen Sheriff, Sheila Stiles, Graham Lustig, they all decided to leave together and form a company called Dance Advance, which I became part of. We all left together, and we had some work by Kenneth Macmillan, who made a piece called Sea of Troubles on us that first season when we started to work as a small group of 8 dancers. Piece by Chu Son Go, an American choreographer, and many of those dancers in the company Dance Advance were also choreographers, so they kind of made a group piece together. I think it was just Stephen Sheriff and I who didn't choreograph at that time. And so that was my kind of step out of Sadler's Wells Royal Ballet. And I did that for about 6 months, I think. And they were wondering Dance Advance were wondering what they would do for their next season and who they might follow up with choreographically. And they had mentioned Lloyd Newson, who came to see us perform, and he said actually after watching us, he realized he couldn't really take on a whole company and make a piece on them. So, but he did ask me if I would leave and join him on the next project. And I didn't know DV8's work at the time, and I saw I went to see a lot of it on video, and I thought it was fantastic, really exciting, and I wanted to work with him on that next project, which became Dead Dreams of Monochrome Men. And it was a very, very different process for me. It was, there was a lot of improvisation, a lot of the other dancers. There was Douglas Wright, who'd been working with Paul Taylor in the States. There was Nigel Charnock, and Lloyd and myself. And they had very different ways of working physically with movement. Nobody would come in and do pliés and tendus and fondus and ronde-jambes, and so they'd be rolling on the floor, or they'd be flinging their arms around and releasing or running, or so it's physical in a very, very different way. And when we started to do certain things in the process, there were times that I felt like I wanted to be able to let go of my classical technique, and yet I couldn't easily let go of it. Well, I couldn't at all let go of it. It was no longer under my conscious control, some of it, maybe the way I held my head.
It's on your body, in your body.
Yeah, it's totally embodied from all of those years of training. And, that was great for being in a company that is doing pure ballet. But, as soon as you step outside of that and the context changes, you realize, well, I don't necessarily have the freedom that I would actually like to have at the moment. So I started to look for ways that I might undo some of that work without, I didn't want to lose my technique. I didn't want to lose my facility, but I did want to be able to, put that on and then take it off. And I was curious as to how possible that was, and whether it would be, positive in its contribution to kind of how much you can do, how much facility you can use, how much technique you can use.
And physically, how did you make that transition? How did you get to a point of being able to remove that classical, armor, and then be able to enable your body to move differently?
Well, I kind of started to get into release technique. A lot of the people that I had met in, I think as I went freelance and went into a different circuit, some of the people that I was meeting, when I started performing with Deviate, or when I started to perform with Laurie Booth, who was an improviser, a lot of that work took me into contact improvisation, which took me into maybe actually working with Laurie Booth. One of the performers there was Scott Clark, who had been working with Siobhan David's company, and he was doing his training as a Feldenkrais practitioner. So a lot of that I became aware of, and then release technique, body-mind centering, a lot of the techniques that were more focused inside, more in a kind of somatic practice. I kind of got into those elements more, and it wasn't a quick process to let go of holding patterns, or even notice where they are, and how to address them, really.
Because when I see you perform, you can still tell there is such a grounding in technique, but it feels like the roots under a tree rather than the flourish of the leaves on top. And the way in which you move and the way in which you choreograph is so beautiful. And as you sort of went on this journey, you worked with creators like Michael Clark, for example, and you mentioned Deviate there. What was it like working with those? We mentioned Deviate, but Michael Clark, etc., in terms of how that influenced you? And I'm really interested to know what inspired you to start creating your own work as well. As you mentioned, back in the company Dance Advance, you were the only one not creating, and here we are talking about you as the creator of one of the most important today in this country.
Well, I think all of those people that I worked with, fed into my understanding or changed the context of how I sat within those different contexts with the technique and the personal practice that I had. And, you know, I learned different things from Michael, who was, you know, obviously impeccably trained classically with a beautiful body and, you know, feet, and the way he could move, really. And, you know, he left the Royal Ballet School before the end of his upper school training and went to Rambert and started his own company. And, you know, the influences that he was bringing in from people like Lee Bowery and Body Map and Charles Atlas, and kind of a very art world perception. And then, you know, working with also Stephen Petronio, as he, at the point that I started to work with Michael, it was not long before he got involved with Stephen Petronio. And then Stephen Petronio's approach, although some of the dynamics and the use of the body might appear similar in certain ways, the approach was from such a different place, because the approach of Stephen Petronio's was more through techniques that might be release techniques. And obviously he'd done a lot of his training with Trisha Brown, and he'd also done a lot of body-mind centering. So Barney Bainbridge Cohen's work, particularly on this musculoskeletal kind of relationship, and, you know, seeing how those practices fed into the body and the result of those in the aesthetic implications and how that was used in the work for each person was kind of fascinating to me. And then when working with Laurie Booth, who had, you know, a background in many of the release techniques, and Steve Paxton and contact, having studied at Dartington, and then also some capoeira background, and how that can influence movement and movement facility, movement possibilities, dynamics, quality. That all just became fascinating to me. And a lot of the ways that we would work with Laurie, I did a project with him called Spatial Decay, and initially with Scott Clark and Jill Clark. So it was a quartet kind of piece, and Laurie taught us improvisation over the process. And a lot of that was about looking at the stage as a blank canvas, and, you know, who's coming on, what color are they painting it, what's the texture, what's the rhythm, what's the pattern, the placement on the stage, and where do you choose to come on next, and with what color, in what place, in what relationship. If you're two people on stage, is it two solos? Is it a duet? Are you creating a counterpoint to what they're doing? Are you amplifying what they're doing? So they're kind of compositional concerns, but they're made in the moment on the improvised journey of a piece. And in the end, that piece, I think we did it together 2 or 3 times. And then Laurie and I performed it as a duet for a few years after that. And that kind of got me very interested in creating, I guess, because that's what we were doing in the performances. And I always feel like personal challenge is something that you grow from. Mm-hmm. And after a few years of performing with Laurie in an improvised duet, I felt like the scariest thing would be to do a solo, an improvised solo, or and there are many different ways of doing improvisation, where it can be totally open, or it can be structured, where you have certain landmarks and a certain framework. And I wanted to create that with Michael Hulls, who was the lighting designer that I had been working with on Spatial Decay in Laura's piece. But he wasn't available at that time, or we started to work on it and I injured my knee. Actually, I tore my cruciate ligament. And so we didn't start work until later. But yeah, it was really from improvisation that I became interested in what might be considered choreography.
And that's interested in what could be considered choreography, which is almost an understatement for, for your work today, of course. But in your own words, and as I mentioned in the introduction, you have a very specific interest in flow and energy. You've mentioned very much there about the inner body and the inner mind, and also this exploration of movement, light, and music, which is so, of course, evident in your work. So I just wanted to, in your own words, how to listeners, how do you describe your own choreographic language?
Well, I don't, if I can help it, because
Okay.
I try to. I always hope that it will continue to evolve, and to a certain extent, it's informed by things that I've done in the past, but it's also informed by dancers that I work with on any project. So the language would be kind of different if I'm working with someone like Dixon MBI, who's had a background in popping and is fantastic at that, before he became trained in contemporary dance, or Dana Foras, who's classically trained, at the Royal Ballet School and the Royal Ballet Company before coming to contemporary dance, and or Sylvie, or each person I think feeds into that language and kind of raises to me another perspective on movement language. But some of the concerns, I guess, are kind of freedom of movement around joints, and how load is taken throughout the whole body. I got particularly interested in tensegrity and also biotensegrity, which is how tensegrity is viewed within the body as a structural model. And some of that is informed by my practice in structural integration and Rolfing, which I trained in 92, 3, 4, and then practiced for 20 years. And how the foot is capable of opening as load is placed, shifted into the foot, and how that talks to the knee, how that talks to the hip and rises up through the pelvis and the ribs and the spine and comes through the arm, those kind of, and how the soft tissue allows that movement or restricts that movement. Those issues might be used in body work as an assessment of where things are held or restricted or blocked. And in a Rolfing session or something like that, you would be looking to create the conditions where movement can go through. And so all of the joints can talk to each other. And I guess, that approach and the aesthetic implications of that work done is something that I has become part of my choreographic analysis, and something that informs also my teaching. So if during a process I'm working with the dancers, we'll often be addressing certain concerns, and we'll bring those up, often amongst ourselves for, if someone's got an issue that is held in the lower back, or someone's held in the shoulders, or someone's held in the ankles, or, we'll kind of work on exercises that might address that, might approach that. And then we'll look at how that affects, what the aesthetic implications of working on that are. And yeah, how that might affect movement in light. So we're putting those things together a little bit. I've kind of...
No, it sounds so beautifully anatomical, is how you're describing it to me. And of course, I have had the privilege and the pleasure to have seen your work. And I know many listeners will jump onto your website and really have a good look to really understand what it is that you're describing, because it does come through in your work where you talk about how, the load on the muscles and the body and the responsiveness and how you create with that and work, and bringing in the work that you have done with the lighting designer, Michael Hulse, that you've just discussed, in your exploration of this, light and music and movement. And I love the way you use light in your work. It is just beautiful. It's so absorbing. So I'd love to know sort of where this particular element has become so important to and integral to your creative process.
Well, when Michael and I met, must have been in the, around 1990, 89, 90, as I said, when I was working with Laurie Booth on spatial decay, and we were both interested in the work of Jennifer Tipton, and a great American lighting designer, and Dana Wrights, who was a release technique dancer, and the way they worked together. And Dance Umbrella invited Jennifer Tipton and Dana to lead a workshop. Michael had already worked with Jennifer Tipton. I took part in the workshop, which was fascinating, and really learnt a lot from that. And Michael and I wanted to create a process where lighting could be one of the first elements, or it be the first element that existed. Often there's a hierarchy. Well, there are many hierarchies in dance, traditional dance, and ballet. So, you get that kind of principal soloist, or even levels of soloist, and then choreographers and corps de ballet. And, in the hierarchies of creating, I would say that music is the one that's in there first, set, then maybe costume, then somewhere down the line where you just get to light it before it goes on stage, which might take a bit of a day before you present it. And, changing that hierarchy where we could have light at the very beginning of a process. So you had an opportunity that they could inform each other. And we were lucky enough to be given space by Christopher Bannerman at Middlesex University, and we over a summer holiday, and we started to. Michael created a rig and a way that the lights might move from, opening the back and then drifting this forwards, widening it sideways, coming into a diagonal, something like this. And I would go in there and work, actually with Dana Foras and James de Maria. And we would look at movement and see what worked coming into the light. How many different ways could we come into the light? Which way was better? What kind of pace? What direction? What quality? And then, if we were bringing this movement forwards, what was the relationship between the intensity of the light, the dynamic of the movement, how many different kind of juxtapositions could work, and what the duration of that needed to be before it opened out to the side. How long could you hold that state for? And that was we created a piece then. We created a piece called Unspoken. And that was about a 55-minute duet. And it was a very informative process and a very informative work. The music came later. And we didn't continue to have that as our perfect process every time. We didn't always start with the light after that, but it was certainly in there for being near the beginning. We might sometimes start the process if we had 8 weeks to work. We might have 2 weeks at the beginning, a week in the middle, and a week at the end. Try for something like that, or we might have 2 weeks of movement in the studio and then have a week in the light to see how that stuff might work together. Then you take that information back to the studio, kind of knowing what those relationships are. So I think after that, I always worked with the intention with light from the start. And, how you work with light is a budgetary issue, really. And rather than going for, if we had a certain budget, rather than making a piece with 6 dancers and knowing that that's where the money is going, we would make a solo or a duet and know that the money is going to be on getting the facilities to work in the light, because that was an important part of our process. And that was, that was always tricky, because generally, I would say that to some extent, successful growth was measured on the amount of dancers on stage and the size of your work. And if after 10 years you're still making solos and duets, then it seemed like, you need to get bigger. And that means you need more people on stage. But the more people on stage, at that point, it seemed the more difficult it is to focus a project onto working with light as a partner. And, actually recently we've made some larger works with more dancers, like 18 dancers. We did a project in Greece called The Thread, working with Vangelis doing the music and Michael doing the lighting. And that was kind of possible to work with more dancers and the light as a partner. But, we'd had 20 odd years of experience by then, 25 years of experience by then. And that piece had a larger budget than, Russell Maliphant Dance Company would get. So,
your work certainly feels like, when you watch it, that, and I love the way you describe light as being a partner in this creative process, a partner in the performance as well, because it certainly does feel like there is another element, not just, as you say, another element that's been, put onto the end, but an intrinsical, true essence, a true presence that's created through the lighting. And it's really interesting to hear you talk about, budget and the, how you're allocating the resources, which are obviously quite finite, and how that affects, the at a point through the perception on what is considered success, when in fact, your work, it's not about the size, is it? And so it's really interesting, actually. The light is so fundamental.
All about that resources and how you allocate it, really. For there aren't so many places other than theatres that have those light resources that you can work in from, during a process, and to afford a facility that has lighting bars and a lighting desk, and that is it's really difficult, which is probably one of the reasons, I'm sure there are many others, but that's one of the reasons that many people don't or can't work that way. We were fortunate to have been given that space that informed us right at the beginning, and we've had, Michael and I have had processes where we've had to bolt on lighting at the end, but we've been together over the process, and so we've been speaking about how this could, how this part could develop, this choreographic part could develop. If we had this light here, we'd want to put everything on the diagonal, or we'd want this to come down panels, or if it's lit in a backlight wash, then we have the whole space, or side light, that it's not defined on the floor, we're very open.
Yeah, I love the work at the Coronet, because the way in which the light was so liquid and really did change the landscape and of the stage. It moved, and it brought a conversation between the dancers. It was that I don't think could have been achieved without the lighting, in fact. Right. It was, really, really sensational, beautiful.
Well, that was, at the Coronet, that was using video design as animation, for constantly changing, shifting lighting. And I think after, a lot of that work with Michael, eventually got me into seeing how the light and the dark textures the space, it textures the body. And I love to see that texture changing. And there aren't so many, you can do that to some extent with generic theatre lighting. I think Michael did that in 98 in 2, where he created a box with a boundary around the side that was brighter. And that really kind of highlighted the periphery of the body as it passed through the brighter parts. And we also explored texture with the video artist Jan Urbanowski in Afterlight, and in 2009, and that possibility of creating ever-changing patterns and shapes and textures, that became really important to me somehow. And I started to work with Panagiotis Tamaris, who's a Greek video designer, and I used him on the pieces at the Coronet, the space between, and also in the last company piece, Silent Lines.
Yeah, beautiful.
And the piece with English National Ballet that we've just finished.
The other element that you are, a key element of yourself is your pursuit of academics. You sort of mentioned a few disciplines that you have already explored and studied, but this pursuit of academic studies in anatomy and physiology and biomechanics, it hasn't ceased, has it? And you're constantly doing research projects, which you've got some going at the moment. What's this curiosity, this constant curiosity to undertake this ongoing research?
I think a little bit about what we were discussing before with kind of holding patterns. And, you know, I think as any dancer wants to have maximum range and potential for articulation and dynamics and freedom of movement around the joints, between the bone joints and the soft tissue joints, and how that all works together to kind of sequence through the body. And, you know, techniques are always evolving. So, you know, people that were looking at movement in particular ways, say through Mabel Todd and the Thinking Body, Lulu Zweigard, or, you know, looking at dance with Alexander, or, you know, practitioners that use more somatic experience, and it always seemed to me that classical ballet is a fantastic technique. And at the same time, the range of choreographers that people are working with now, you know, sometimes it would be really helpful to have some of the information that is not embodied in classical techniques. So, you know, how can you do that within a classical company, or how would, even outside of a classical company, within a classical practice, you know, training of children, training at schools, how would you do that so that people are maximally prepared to do work by Forsyth or Akram Khan or Hofesh Schechter or Crystal Pite, as well as Sleeping Beauty and Swan Lake, and so that,
which is very much expected now of dancers, to have this physicality that is so versatile, to be able to really take on a huge repertoire of work. It's quite the challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a massive challenge. And you've got to, you know, some of those lines of work, they're a practice that, you know, how long does it take you to really understand a practice? It's got to be like 10, 15 years to get deep into that. And, you know, if you're trying to perform a work, but you don't understand what that work is necessarily embedded within, then it will be more superficial than the possibilities of that. So that, you know, there's always a kind of an exploration of how far we can journey out into this process together. You know, fortunately, I understand a certain amount of classical understanding and analysis, and I can kind of feed in other elements as I think they might help. But you know, as work is evolving, there are different people that I become familiar with, you know, and it's so easy to get familiar with them now, not just through books, but through YouTube tutorials or Instagram, IGTV, and you can become aware of people that are anywhere in the world. You know, since I did the Rolfing training, you know, that opened up an avenue into a lot of the bodywork practices. And you know, I continue to follow Tom Myers, who has looked into something called anatomy, or evolved something called anatomy trains, and how that might work in movement and yoga. And that's quite a different approach to muscles having an origin and an insertion, and looking at mechanical movement of limbs. So I think all of these approaches have an aesthetic implication, there's I've been interested in the work of Gary Ward, who wrote a book called What the Foot, which also has aesthetic implications about it's really looking at how all of the joints talk together again. There's a great what would you call him, coach, I guess, David Gray, who I've also been looking at and done some sessions with, which I find them really fascinating, how they change movement. And, you know, they're not looking at that in relationship to classical ballet or contemporary dance or, you know, these kind of movement arts. But I think more and more people are becoming aware of movement being an important part of, you know, whether it's football, rugby, tennis, but how the movement potential around a joint is affecting the whole, and how that hip is in relationship to the 33 joints in the foot, you know, and how that's passing through the ribs or the spine, or the you know, what the soft tissue is doing in that relationship, how it affects the head, you know, all of those kind of things that really are about movement. And I like to explore that and see how that might influence the health and safety, really, and the longevity of a dancer in work, because it's, you know, if you're putting a lot of strain, I mean, some of the big jumps that you might have in classical work, you know, it's a lot of load and impact, and if you do that incredibly well and all the joints are functioning and, you know, that load is distributed well through the body, then, you know, you minimize injury and impact. Whereas if one joint is taking a lot of that load, and the repetition is constant, and even if it's just a little bit too much each time, you know, it soon builds up, and, you know, it impacts the body.
You mentioned longevity there. You've been dancing yourself over the last couple of decades, as you've also been running the Russell Maliphant Dance Company. And you've also had your injuries, as you've mentioned. I'm interested in knowing sort of how you keep dancing.
I think that, you know, if you have a personal practice that you can keep kind of ticking over, if you put your mind into your body for you know, an hour and a half, for example, a day, and you're going deeper into that practice, then I think your body is better. It works better, all the parts together, than if you don't have that. So I'm certainly improved by that practice if I do that all the time. You know, sometimes there might be, you know, periods in my life where I find that difficult to maintain. But generally, I try to keep that as my baseline. And, you know, teaching allows me to do that also, maybe slightly differently. And then if I'm putting myself in a work, then I know that I will need X amount of weeks or months to build up to a performance level. And there will be certain things that I'll have to work through. And, you know, you are looking to perform. So, you know, there are certain things that you need to have moving fluidly or sequentially, or in a way that might not be so necessary if you are just looking to maintain a a certain level of standard where you're not going to be on show.
Yeah, you mentioned your teaching there. So teaching is a very essential part of what you do and what the company also does. And looking at where the company is, given the COVID situation, there's been a shift towards digital dance and making some of the sort of more projects available and online company classes. How has the shift towards the digital been for you and where you are with the company? Because you are heading towards the 25th anniversary. What does that feel like for you?
I mean, so much of what we do or what we have done before this time, there's a kinesthetic learning and sharing. And some of that is about a hands-on kind of work. If a teacher puts a certain pressure on you, on your body in a particular way, and you understand how to let go of these muscles and you understand how to lengthen here, or that's a physical passing on of information, which kind of can be done without words or with minimal words. And if you try and do that purely with words, it's another language that you have to use. And I think we're, over the past 6 months, we've been driven more into finding that capability, of language or imagery to pass on that information. And, in teaching recently, a lot of it is Zoom.
Yeah.
So your camera is in a set point, and there's no point teaching in a studio because most people that are on the other end of the line only have, 6 foot square of space anyway in front of the computer screen. So a lot of that potential is it's not about moving through space as much. It's about moving in the space that you're in with changing qualities, which is interesting. And there's infinite potential even in that restricted model. And that's fascinating, and that has a lot of interest. And of course, I miss being in the studio with people also. And I miss that movement through space at times. But I think at the moment, that's not something that you could do on a Zoom class. But there is a phenomenal amount that you can do standing still, without moving your feet, just moving all of the joints in different combinations through the body, and different pressures and different layers of the body, and skin layer, and then going one layer deeper, and then going into the bones, or going into the organs, or going into the fluids, and all of those things are there's a huge amount of range potential in those, and explorations there's potential in those, and exploring your own anatomy.
It's interesting that within those 6 foot confines, the attention or the focus turns back to the body, which is where your attention often is, rather than, as you say, moving through the space, which is quite interesting how, the situation has reflected almost your own interests, right, very much in the internal. Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, because, two is, it happens within a 2 meter square, and shift also, which is one that was lit from the front in panels. It also, it restricts movement to within more or less the range that your body is in. You can shift around certain rotations and tilts and hikes and, things like the body of relationships, but it's about the relationship of one part to another, which is an analysis that Rolfing uses. Rolfing divides the body into kind of 8 sections and then looks at the relationship of the head to the neck, or the neck to the chest, or the chest to the abdomen to the pelvis to the thighs. Is it tilted? Is it rotated? Is it shifted forward or back? Or, those kinds of things, which are very choreographic to my mind, my analysis of movement.
And with the 25th anniversary horizon coming your way, I'm interested in how you are, or if you are, thinking about legacy and thinking about how you are, and we're talking here about the digital space, but how you are able to capture your particular approach and pass that on. You mentioned teaching and passing it on through your classes and through your dancers and through your work and through the digital, but in terms of how do you capture that and ensure that that legacy exists going forward and beyond?
Well, the pandemic and having time at home during lockdown, we started to organise something called our digital archive of work, which is really it's just past performances that we have on VHS tape or high 8 tape or mini DV, or which are all dotted around, all the Betacam, or all of these different devices, which are kind of obsolete because you don't have a player for those anymore.
Yeah.
Hundreds of these tapes, and kind of it's often coming through my, like, do I throw these now? Do I put them in an archive box? But they all, actually you get some out of the the place that they've been in storage, and they've got damp, and a lot of them are ruined, or they'll play 3 seconds and then freeze, and 3 seconds and freeze, and 3 seconds, and so they're all jumpy, and it's like, well, why have I kept these for 25 years and like this, and I can't play them anyway, and I've got to kind of get a player to watch them to know that they don't work or they do work. And so that's been a job that's been put off for years and years and years. And having some of that time at home, we're like, okay, well, this is one of the things that actually now I can start going through, and if there's anything in there, we can put it up. But recording has got so much better over the years, and you look at some of these things that were, wasn't a life, well, it was some people's lifetime ago, but it was like 30 years ago, and we weren't doing the performance to have a great record. We were doing the performance and recording it so that we could see it and work on it so that the next performance would be better. But it was never about getting that recording out there as a means in itself,
documenting and sharing the entertainment factor of it.
Exactly. Yeah. So the lighting for them, it was always difficult to capture low levels of light, and a lot of the work was done in low levels of light for parts of it, and that was kind of part of the logic of it. There's an experience that happens as your eye adjusts to a low level of light, and you get drawn into this, and then gradually it gets bigger and bigger, and it's coming out at you, and there's a movement in the audience as they get drawn in or pushed out or affected by those levels of light. And that's a choreographic movement that's intended in the work. So, if you're not going to get that in the recording, which, of course, ways of recording have got so much better now, and so what we could put together now is quite different. But still, there there are good performances that I think are interesting to see from those early days, and that's, you know, we've been organising a bit of that, and you know, some of those for recreations, you know, or the potential for recreation, so that we could, or restagings of some of the works, and I like to restage things so that, like personally, so that I can keep adjusting them to what I'm seeing on the dancers that are interpreting those kind of parts, and so it becomes a live dialogue that we're shifting together, so that the framework, the structure, you know, the main part of is together, but it might shift in other ways. So.
And looking to the future, I know that you've got a few dates in the diary potentially for Germany, which are opening up, obviously, or have opened theatres, and dancers has returned much earlier than mostly across the world, in fact. Look, obviously the future is so hard to predict these days, and who knows whether or not those shows will go ahead. But what are you looking forward to? What does the future horizon for Russell Maliphant and for the dance company look like for you?
I'm looking forward to being in the studio. I'm looking forward to working with dancers to create something new in light. And whatever that's for, whether that's for digital output or theatrical output, or any other way that we haven't perceived yet.
Virtual reality output.
Yes, absolutely. You know, whatever that is. I think a lot of my enjoyment is in the studio, and exploring, really, the exploring process, exploring language, and how different languages can inform each other, so that there's not a hierarchy to movement language, and actually something that's coming in from rugby or osteopathy, or coaching, you know, any of those different sources can equally inform movement as much as Shiketti or Cunningham or Martha Graham, or, you know, any of the great techniques that are around, and how those things might affect quality. They might affect aesthetics, and how those can be utilized in movement potential and movement awareness.
And now that we've sort of looked forward somewhat, without this crystal ball, looking back over the last 2.5 decades, do you have a piece of work that is exceptionally important to you? You know, you've created such incredible work, you know, Push, Fall, and, you know, of late, you know, Second Breath, Silent Lines, Afterlight, you know, Still Current, Conceal, Reveal, you know, the list goes on, and you've talked about some of them. But is there a particular piece that is really important to you, and why?
No, they're all important to me for different reasons. Probably, I mean, two is the piece that we've been performing the longest, in a way, and I think that that's probably one of the pieces that has informed, and probably has informed me the most, and also the process of working on that. You know, it was created on Dana Foras. It was later performed by Sylvie Guillem, Carlos Acosta, Roberto Bolle, Daniel Proieto. There's many different
yeah.
it.
It's an unfair question to ask you to choose essentially from your children, as it were, from your creations. Yeah.
But I think having a piece that is set and yet kind of adjusted on many different people, that's been interesting. I've enjoyed having that to work on, and also seeing Dana through those different stages and ages, performing a work and still being able to grow in it. That's
Dana's been quite an important partner of many things in your life, and that partnership comes through so profoundly in your work. And as my sort of second to last question, really, in terms of how that feels to work together with someone over such a career.
I think that a partnership over that time, it's changing, it's evolving, and it's exploring. So Dana's taken photographs for the company, and myself, she's written music for the last 5 pieces that I've done, and I think that's because she understands something that is informed by some of those earlier times, like the creation of Two, or she's seen us working on Afterlight or Push, or so we have an understanding of how that the process is what things benefit from in that process. And for me, choreography is where it's not the movement per se, it's where movement and light mix as the visual elements, and music comes in to link and uphold those visual elements as that auditory component. And I think that she understands that process very, very well, and she can contribute and work with those parameters that just in the way that Michael and I have an understanding that's evolved over many processes or many years.
So then my last question to you is, as a choreographer, are there words of wisdom that you live by that you would share with others, or words of advice that you would pass on to other creators or those trying to forge a career, perhaps in these times? Tough one.
Yeah, I think it's a really tough one, and a really tough one at this time, because really at any time I would say, do what you love, do what brings you energy, and keep adapting as that shifts in your life. Because to go through sacrifices and hard times, if you're doing what brings you the most joy, if you're doing what brings you the most satisfaction and the most most satisfaction, most joy, then it accounts for a lot. And you never know when the going's going to get tough, which it is tough at the moment.
Absolutely.
And seeing some of the talent that is around and the young talent that is up and coming, they're going to, it's not a question of talent, but they're going to have resources to maintain and sustain that. That's what will make a difference in developing and exploring. And I would say if they've got those things, they're on a good path. And maybe also having a second string to your bow. For me, that was Rolfing. So, when I was working as a freelancer at the beginning, if you're involved in a project, but then that project goes astray, and if you have nothing, that's hard financially. If you have something else that you also love, that can pick up the slack in those times, it's easier to roll through those tricky times.
That's really good practical advice and also inspirational advice. So thank you very much for your time today. That has been a wonderful, wonderful exploration of your work. And so thank you again. And just for listeners, you can see the work of Russell Maliphant and in the company's digital archives and performances that are coming up if you're lucky, for example, to be in Germany. So don't forget to follow the Russell Maliphant Dance Company on Instagram as well. Thanks so much.
Don't forget to subscribe. We've got some incredible interviews coming up with principal ballerinas and renowned choreographers. We love dance and ballet, and we hope you'll love us. Join us on Facebook and Twitter.